Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli wa nusallimu ala rasulihil kareem. Amma ba'd, and welcome to another video on the Islamic Knowledge YouTube channel. And before we go any further, if I can encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel and consider sharing this video with others so that inshallah it can benefit others as well. And in today's video, we're looking at an interesting book titled The Origins of Islamic Jurisprudence, Meccan Fiqh Before the Classical Schools. Now, in Western academia, there was essentially a very skeptical impression on the hadith corpus of the Prophet ﷺ, and generally they treated the Muslim preservation of ahadith as a huge mess and collaborative manipulation. And we've made a video on this channel on Joseph Schacht's book and the refutations that were written on that book. So this skeptical impression remained until a German orientalist called Harald Motzki, and this is the author right here, wrote a book in German. So this book was actually originally in German, which used earlier sources like Musannaf Abdul Razzaq, and this is what we refer to as part of the Western revisitation, or you could say the Western reconsideration of the hadith corpus, and he was one of the leading figures of this movement. Indeed, the Prophet ﷺ did say, Inna Allah la yu'ayyidu hadha ad-deen bi rajulil fajir, and I don't believe the author passed away as a Muslim, I'm not 100% sure, but we have to rule by what is apparent. But despite the fact that the author did not pass away as a Muslim, despite that, this book really does support the hadith corpus, but we'll discuss it in a bit of detail just now. Now, over 3 years ago, we had a visit to our madrasa from Sheikh Nizam al-Yaqubi from Bahrain, who mentioned that there was a lot of pushback in the Western academic circles in getting this book published in English, but he finally managed to finance the translation of this book. So sometimes the Western academia can give the impression that they're very open to criticism, but we saw this even in our video on Sheikh Mustafa Al-Azami's book, that there was a lot of pushback even when Sheikh Ahmed Amin wanted to write a kind of critique on Joseph Schacht, I think in Cambridge or Oxford. He was refused from writing this. And same thing here, there was a little bit of pushback. That's what Sheikh Nizam said to us. There was a little bit of reluctance, and nobody was really wanting to do this, and he was the one who kind of financed the translation of this book. And in fact, the author of this book, Harald Motzki, thanks Sheikh Nizam al-Yaqubi in the preface of this translation, as he writes in the preface. So if we read the preface here, he says in the preface here, he says, and he's speaking about Sheikh Nizam here, I owe a great debt to Sheikh Nizam Yaqubi Manama, who made the publication of the book possible by supporting its translation and editing with a grant. I also wish to thank Professor Wadad Al-Qadi, who agreed to accept the book for publication in her series Islamic History and Civilization and offered valuable corrections and suggestions. So now, what's this book all about? I do have some notes that I have made on this book, and they are quite copious amounts of notes, to be honest, and I will make them into a PDF and I will put them on the Islamic Knowledge Telegram channel. So just hop on over to Telegram and just type in on the search bar at IK Courses, as you can see in the center of the screen, and you'll find a PDF of my notes on this book that was written by Motzki, The Origins of Islamic Jurisprudence, Meccan Fiqh Before the Classical Schools, and you can just see some of the interesting points in the book. So essentially, in 1950, Joseph Schacht wrote a book called Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence, and there are so many theories he came up with in this book, as you can see in our video that we've made on the book and the refutation on that. But essentially, his primary thesis is what you're going to see on this paper here. Now, this is a very summarized version of what he's saying, but this is the gist of what he's saying. He's saying that in the time of the successors, or the Sigharu Tabi'in, or maybe even below them a little bit, approximately 125 Hijri, that's when he believes all of the ahadith was sort of made up. This is generalizing his actual theory, but this is the gist of what he's saying. That's when it's made up. And as you go along in time, so you can see the blue circle here, during the blue circle time, which is approximately around 125 to 150 Hijri, that's when this same statement that was made in 125 is back projected onto the Sahabi. And then when we get to this red circle here, which is approximately after Imam Shafi'i, or about 150 to 250, that's when this same statement is now basically, the red circle is kind of like what we refer to as a back projection. He's saying this statement is now back projected onto the Prophet ﷺ. Now, this theory sounds like you might think, okay, interesting, maybe that is what happened, but it doesn't work out. And it's a very, very essentialist view of the ahadith, and it's trying to basically, it's not a lot of respect given to the ahadith and how the ahadith were compiled there. So this is where Motzki's book does come in. The title of the book might give you the impression that it's directly related to the history of fiqh, but it's actually a critique of Schacht's understanding of the historicity of ahadith. So while Schacht claimed that Imam Malik may have been the only scholar who recorded a certain hadith from Az-Zuhri or any of the other narrators, Motzki comes in and he uses the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq to show that his narrations from Ibn Jurayj are historically reliable, and then Ibn Jurayj's narrations from Ata are also historically reliable, which means that the narration is already existing in the time of Ata, who passed away in I believe 114 Hijri, which is well before Imam Malik. So it wasn't that Imam Malik was the first one to come across this hadith. Now, Motzki isn't really proving that the corpus of a ahadith are all established from the Prophet ﷺ. Obviously, he's not going to do that as a non-Muslim Western academic, but yeah, he does entertain that possibility right from the start of the book as well. And coming from a Western non-Muslim scholar, by the way, this was a very important milestone, as for the first time ever we had, as what Jonathan Brown calls in his book Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, Jonathan Brown explains in this book that Motzki was the first writer, Western writer, to kind of look at the ahadith with a sense of respect. And for the first time ever, we had a writer who was basically going to give the ahadith a little bit of respect compared to the early type of, you could say, criticism that was coming from the likes of Golzai, Schacht and Joinbull. So we had, for example, from here, he says, in a sense, Motzki, and this is now Jonathan Brown writing, in a sense, Motzki is the first Western scholar to treat hadiths with the same respect as Muslim hadith masters did. And so what exactly did this book do, and what does it cover? Well, first off, I want to quote to you a very ironic comment made by the author, Harald Motzki, about Joseph Schacht's book on the origins of Muhammadan jurisprudence, where he says on page 30, and he's speaking about Schacht's book, and the first chapter is, by the way, an introduction to all the different books written on the history of Islamic jurisprudence. So he says here, and it's quite ironic that he says this, he says, the origins, although a book which demands the highest degree of motivation and endurance from the reader, has been reprinted regularly since its appearance, even in a paperback edition. Now, I thought this was very ironic, considering the fact that I can honestly say Motzki's book is an even harder read than Schacht's book. It's basically full of statistical analysis. You'll see percentages. You're just reading numbers all throughout the book, more or less, and then there are some few inferences that he draws right at the end. So he kind of draws all the dots together in terms of the relevance to his research and on the history of it, more or less near the end of the book. So the first chapter of the book is a historical overview of all the different books written on the history of Islamic law, which is actually quite an interesting read. And it on page 11, for example, he explains how it was Ignaz Golzai who kind of changed the whole history of understanding of hadith in the Western world, at least. He kind of was the first one to create doubt on the actual Muslim sources, that are you actually sure that the Sunnah is actually the Sunnah of the Prophet, or the Quran is the Quran from Allah? And more or less in Western academia, the Quran question is almost out of the question. They're more or less accepting it, but there is still some people who have some skepticism. But when it comes to hadith, it was Ignaz Golzai who turned against the idea that Islamic jurisprudence developed out of the application of the fundamental sources of law, the Quran and Sunnah, an idea which presupposed that the Sunnah of the Prophet and the companions was available from the earliest times and offered sufficient material for the purpose. His position should be scrutinized in more detail since it deeply influenced the research of the 20th century. He then speaks about Schacht, he speaks about the refutations given on Schacht, he speaks about Sheikh Mustafa al-Azami's book as well, although I don't think his criticism on Sheikh Mustafa al-Azami was that rigorous, to be honest. So it's in the second chapter now where the book gets really interesting. Essentially what he does is he takes Musannaf Abdul Razak, who passed away in 211 Hijri, and who most likely wrote his book Musannaf Abdul Razak around 190 Hijri to 210 Hijri approx, and says, well, let's look at all the sources of Abdul Razak. Well, he doesn't look at all the sources, i.e. who are the people that Abdul Razak is constantly narrating from in his Musannaf. So what the author does is he selects 3,180 ahadith, and he finds the four most common people that Abdul Razak narrates from, and they are Ma'mar, Ibn Jurayj, Sufyan al-Thawri and Sufyan ibn Uyayna. So this is where he's explaining his methodology in research. So he says on page 60, and he's giving you a table of all of their narrations and the different forms of their narrations, exactly what is happening in the narration. He says that these profiles show that each source has a completely individual face. It is unlikely that a forger ordering materials and equipping them with false labels would create units so strongly differentiated from each other. At the same time, it is to be noted that the profiles only represent very rough outlines, and the differences are reinforced as one goes into greater detail. For instance, inquiring into the geographical affiliations of the sources or the formal characteristics of the text. He gets further into detail about all of these issues as well. But now he has to determine whether Abdul Razak is not the forger of these traditions found in his Musannaf. So what if he's making up these teachers? So Motzki uses something he refers to right in the introduction. He has a page wherein he speaks about this, and he says that I will use the criteria of authenticity for determining whether Abdul Razak or any of his sources are speaking the truth. He says, using the examples of two strands of sources, it is possible to show that a number of arguments, which I call criteria of authenticity, speak for the credibility of the statements of transmission which are made by the authors or compilers of these sources of the first half of the 2nd or 8th century. So he uses that on page 61. He says, for example, some formal characteristics which are conspicuous, i.e. they're very clear, in Abdul Razak's presentation of the traditions point in the same direction. For instance, the fact that Abdul Razak occasionally expresses his uncertainty about the exact origin of a tradition. An example, Abdul Razak from Ath-Thawri, from Mughira, or someone else. Abu Bakr, i.e. Abdul Razak, was unsure about it from Ibrahim, who said, in the case of a notorious forger, such doubts are scarcely to be expected because they would compromise his actual aim, the feigning of certain and unbroken transmission. So the four main sources of Abdul Razak also wrote a number of books, as we know, and if we can assess the way they narrate from their supposed teachers, i.e. the four main teachers of Abdul Razak from this sample that he took, if we can assess their teachers and the way they narrate from them, it would help to shed light on whether they are legitimate translations, whether they are legitimate transmissions. But before that, we can't look at all four, as it would take too long, and Abdul Razak narrates from all four of them and more. So what he decided to do instead, Motzki, on page 74, he explains that I took only two strands, and he says, I have chosen two of Abdul Razak's textual traditions, those of Ibn Jurayj and Ibn Uyayna, for a pilot study. One reason for this choice is that both are Meccan scholars. Since we know as good as nothing about the development of jurisprudence in Mecca in the first and second centuries, conditions in Medina and Kufa have been much more thoroughly researched and depicted. There is an opportunity to fill this gap with the help of the materials of the two figures named. Another decisive factor was the observation of certain formal characteristics of the Ibn Jurayj source, which seemed particularly favorable for the determination of the provenance and authenticity of the text contained in it. So he's taking Ibn Jurayj. Abdul Razak constantly narrates from four people, so he's taking his narrations from Ibn Jurayj and Ibn Uyayna. Now this chapter 3, this is where everything more or less kicks off, and this chapter more or less goes from page 75 all the way up until page 293. So it's a massive chapter when he's now studying the sources, i.e. the people that Ibn Jurayj narrates from. So Abdul Razak constantly narrates from Ibn Jurayj and Ibn Uyayna. These are the two people he's taking, and Ibn Jurayj constantly narrates from his two main sources, which are Ata ibn Abi Rabah and Amr ibn Dinar. So you will see the vast majority of chapter 3 now, he's going to use percentages, he's going to work his way up basically from Abdul Razak upwards, up through Ibn Jurayj, through Ata, and then above that as well at times. And the other version is from Abdul Razak through Ibn Jurayj, through Amr ibn Dinar. So you can see percentages, Ibn Jurayj's legal opinion. At times he'll create a little bit of a diagram for us to see, and he'll speak about Ata's sources. So you can see there's quite a detailed discussion on the characteristics of Ata's legal scholarship and its significance for the history of Islamic jurisprudence. He speaks about the general characteristics of the narrations that Ibn Jurayj narrates from Ata, and you can see he speaks about Ata's sources. What does Ata constantly quote? He quotes the Quran, he quotes the Sunnah. So he's more or less in the process of explaining, and he uses loads of percentages as well, by the way. I mean, you might not be able to see it in the video clearly, but there are a number of places when he'll be speaking about how 50% of the narrations of Ibn Jurayj are like this, and 50% of the narrations of Amr ibn Dinar are like this, and 50% of, or 76% of the narrations of Ata are of such a nature. And he goes nitty-gritty into the text. You can see here, for example, the number of the true dicta exceeds that of the traditions several times, 70% as compared to 30%. Mixed forms, for instance, those in which Ata provides his opinion with a tradition, are rare, 1%. As a rule, opinions and traditions are cleanly separated. So you can see loads of percentages used. Now, as he's analyzing these chains of transmission, he also critiques along the way a number of ideas and theories that are in vogue amongst the Orientalists. So for example, on page 89, he critiques, using an example, by the way, the famous idea of Joseph Schacht, which was the E Silencio argument. So he says here, he gives an example. He says, the following examples as well illustrate the untenability of the theory of projection and the weakness of the inferences of E Silencio. Ibn Jurayj from Ata, Ibn Zubayr made her the Walad, a portion of the inheritance of her son. With traditions from the early period of Islam, it is sometimes to be observed that later sources, whether compilations or commentaries, provide the names of people involved who are not named in the text of older collections. It has been concluded from this is the E Silencio idea, that if earlier scholars did not quote it, it didn't exist. From this, that these names were not known to the original transmitters, and then that they are in the inventions of later generations. This may occasionally be true, but one may not regard it as the rule, as the following variant of the above tradition proves. And then he gives a literal visual example of how that tradition completely breaks the whole concept of E Silencio. Now, as I've alluded to above, some people view Motzki as some type of hero for hadith, and so they view him in a very positive light. In reality, Motzki is still a skeptic. So although he's arguing that statements were attributed to the Prophet at the very least from the end of the 1st century, he's still a skeptic on what the Western academics call the improvement of asanid. So he feels original asanid were actually broken and that they were later improved, or he's indicating towards that in a number of places. And on page 203, he kind of explicitly says it. He says this tradition is also transmitted in this form from Amr ibn Dinar by Ibn Uyayna. On the other hand, Muhammad ibn Muslim, a contemporary of Ibn Uyayna, names as Amr's source Abu Sha'tha. A half century later, it turns up in Abu Dawud's Sunan work with a continuous isnad ending Muhammad ibn Muslim, Amr ibn Dinar, Abu Sha'tha, Ibn Abbas, the Prophet. Since both Ibn Jurayj and Ibn Uyayna transmit the hadith as mu'dal and the trustworthiness of their transmission from Amr is probable, the other versions are to be classed as ex post facto attempts to improve the isnad. Abu Sha'tha should be chalked up to Muhammad ibn Muslim, Ibn Abbas to a transmitter after him. Such examples can be multiplied. So he's automatically accusing a few people of basically lying, and he's made his decision that this has been basically improvement of isnad. The only issue is when we check some of these chains of transmissions and we gather all of the different versions, either the muhaddithun have explicitly said this, that the isnad has been improved, or they actually show that the improved version, or what you think is the improved, the connected version, was there right from the early period as well. So that's the main issue with this book. And in terms of the final conclusions that Motzki comes to after analyzing the Meccan traditions of Abdul Razak, then they are quite interesting, and that is basically the last part of the book, and basically chapter 3 more or less tires you out, and then you get to see the final results at the end. So he highlights the impact of Abdullah ibn Abbas to the fiqh of Makkah. He says on page 238, Ata ibn Abi Rabah owes a portion of his legal knowledge and probably also the impetus to pursue such questions to his teacher Ibn Abbas. The formative influence of this personality on the development of Meccan legal scholarship is also to be detected in the case of the younger Amr ibn Dinar, who received his education primarily from students of Ibn Abbas, through whom he also received and passed on his teachings. Along with this, Motzki highlights how the usage of asanid was more common in Medina than it was in other areas, which could suggest the commonly held idea that although the Ahlul Ra'i and Ahlul Hadith is not limited to certain geographical areas, it's not incorrect to say that there was a higher tendency towards Ra'i in Kufa than there was in Medina Munawwara. And so he writes on page 235, and this is quite interesting, he says, the use of the isnad or the identification of informants for traditions varies in the individual source of Ibn Jurayj. Isnads are very rare with Ata ibn Abi Rabah and Ibn Tawus. They reach less than 50% with, for instance, Ibn Abi Mulayka, Amr ibn Shu'ayb, Abdul Karim and Ata al-Khurasani. Chains of transmission and informants are frequent above all with the Medinans like Ibn Shihab, Hisham ibn Urwa, Yahya ibn Sa'id and Musa ibn Uqba, but also with the Meccans, Amr ibn Dinar and Abu Zubayr, who show a quite profound Medinan influence in other ways as well, or who are known to be of Medinan origin. Another interesting aspect which I found was his thesis that there was a source of sort of Meccan practice, much like there was a Kufan practice and Medinan practice, Amal, there was also a Meccan practice or a local ijma, if you will, around 125 Hijri that already existed. And so he says on page 186, he says here that he speaks about another component is perhaps to be sought in the fact that both of them come from a common local legal tradition, which then must have already developed in the 1st century. So all in all, a step in the right direction for once from the Western Orientalists, but I still believe a lot of progress still needs to be made from their side in terms of the sources they use and in terms of their understanding of the Arabic language itself. I hope you did enjoy this video and do join us for the next one. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.